Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where today I actually had to record this intro twice because when I recorded it the first time my camera was out of focus. But yes, today we're going to be looking at the overnight viewing figures for episode 1 of season 2, The Robot Revolution, and I have no doubt that across today you're going to see a bunch of videos saying the sky is falling and the end is near from the usual suspects, as Doctor Who did technically score its lowest overnight figure last night. However, there are several mitigating factors to this that I think several places won't include that I'm going to include for full context. And I've tried to actually be as thorough in terms of my kind of research here as I can. So I hope you enjoy this video. Like the video if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new, that would be greatly appreciated. But let's get right into it. So, I'm taking this from TV Zone. Ratings: Doctor Who makes quiet return for second season on BBC One. Doctor Who returned to BBC One on Saturday 12th of April, The Robot Revolution, which scored an overnight figure of 2.0 million, so 2 million basically. The consolidated rating, which will include iPlayer, devices and catch-up, will be released 21st of April. So this is the crucial thing when we actually look at this figure. This does not include everyone who watched it on iPlayer and other devices prior to broadcast. This just includes people watching it live on television on BBC One. So when you look at it like that, it's really not that important of a figure. The important figure comes, to be honest, with the 7-day figure, especially in Doctor Who's case specifically, because it was made available to the public 12 hours, in fact a bit more than that, before it was broadcast on television. So you've got to understand that that would at least add a couple 100,000 onto Doctor Who's overnight total for the BBC. It's also worth noting that this doesn't actually factor in Disney, of course, this is just the UK. But this is where it gets really interesting. It was the 4th most watched programme of the day across all channels and streamers, and the 2nd most watched for BBC One behind the Gladiators, which was watched by 2.9 million. So this is a really important factor to consider. Even though that number is lower, and even though it's made artificially lower by the fact that it was released early, it still was the 4th most watched programme of the day and the 2nd most watched programme on the BBC, only behind Gladiators, which scored 2.9 million. And again, I make the case that that gap would be closer if not for the fact that Doctor Who releases early and the iPlayer early figures are not included in the final sum, at least until the 7-day consolidated figures come out. Now, I did reach out to TV Zone to ask them whether they could give me any more information on this top 4 statistic, and while they couldn't give me a list of the top 10 programmes, they did give me a list of everything that Doctor Who was above and gave me a rough indication for what Britain's Got Talent scored last night, and they've given me permission to share that with you. So I said, hey, just a quick question, do you have a top 10 list for the overnights last night? Because I was curious to see, what the chart was overall. And they said, hey, we don't have that available, sorry. I can tell you Doctor Who was the 4th most watched show of the day behind Britain's Got Talent, the 1% Club and Gladiators in that order, so Britain's Got Talent being the highest, which makes sense. In that order, Britain's Got Talent got around the 4 million mark. So I think this is something that's really important to understand here, is the absolute peak of broadcasts for the BBC this evening was just under 3 million, and for TV as a whole, it was just about 4 million with Britain's Got Talent. So when we look at these figures, it's important to acknowledge that nothing this evening got 6, 7, 8 million viewers, like some people will always say, oh, Doctor Who used to get that. Newsflash, nothing is getting that overnight anymore for most of the year, with the exception pretty much of Christmas and a few breakout successes and one-offs. Most regular shows in the UK in terms of overnight figures are hovering around the 2 to 3 to 4 million range, depending on time of the year with which they're released and stuff like that. And obviously we can see that last year, we had similar things where episode 1 and 2 were watched by 2.6 and 2.4 respectively, and went on to appreciate to viewing figures of around the 4 million mark. So it's important to note this is just the overnight figure. While I'm not going to say that Doctor Who is performing fantastically at the moment, I'd definitely like to see it perform a bit better, Russell T Davies has said that. I also don't think you can really say it's the apocalypse that a lot of people are probably going to proclaim it is, when it's still the 4th most watched show in the UK, including television and streaming services, and the 2nd most watched on the BBC specifically. I think, if anything, what viewing figures show us is the decline of live viewing figures for TV in the UK, as opposed to Doctor Who in specific more than anything. I wanted to compare it as well to Legend of the Sea Devils, and the reason I'm comparing it to that is because it actually did get a similar amount. This time it was 2.2 million, which, if we count in the iPlayer figures that have yet to be included from people who watched throughout the day, is probably about similar to what the Robot Revolution got, maybe a little bit less. I'm also comparing these two because they aired at, somewhat similar times of the year, the 12th of April and the 18th of April, respectively, and also both will be affected by the decline of live TV viewing figures in the 2020s, although even with that, it's important to say that even 3 years on, that number has only continued its general decline. Again, as I've said, with a few TV show exceptions, which I think people will point out, but it doesn't stop the overall trend that, live viewing figures are way, way down year on year on year. It's just the reality. No one watches live TV anymore. Except on Christmas, when everyone just has the TV on. And that was the 11th most watched programme of the day, and was beaten by Antiques Roadshow on BBC Two at 2.26 million. Now, obviously, these numbers will also have been higher, given the fact that it was Easter. It tends to be that whenever there's a kind of big holiday going on, there tends to be higher viewing figures. And Britain's Got Talent won the night with 5 million, so that, again, that's about 1 million more than it got with this viewing figure. But the reason I'm pointing this out is to say that whilst this number is on a technicality currently higher, it was still the 11th most watched programme of the day, as opposed to 4th. Now again, there are other factors to this viewing figure itself, of course, but the point I'm making is just that 4th most watched programme of the day and 2nd most watched on the BBC without iPlayer is not the worst thing in the world. Yes, when I read it was technically the lowest overnight figure, I was like, oh no. But actually, when you look at the numbers and you actually look at the statistics and you look at what everything else did that night, Gladiators, which was number 1, only got 2.9 million compared to Doctor Who's 2 million, and again, that's without its iPlayer figures, so Doctor Who would probably be around 2.2, 2.3 if previous statistics hold out in terms of in the day prior to broadcast. So while it does seem low, and I certainly would like it if Doctor Who was the most watched programme on the BBC that day, it's definitely not this is definitely going to get cancelled smoking gun that I think it's probably going to be treated as. And even then, the main thing that we need to do well, more than anything else, is Disney. It's fairly obvious that the BBC want to keep Doctor Who. The question is whether Disney do. That's the question. But that's my thoughts on the viewing figures. No doubt I'll have some people saying I'm spinning it, but I think to just report the 2 million figure and not mention the fact that it was the 4th most watched thing of the day and the 2nd most watched thing on the BBC in itself is a form of spin. I'm giving all of the context to this figure rather than just the one number, which on its own doesn't really mean anything, especially, again, as I said, it doesn't include iPlayer. But let me know your thoughts. I'm sure the comments on this video will be lovely as always for viewing figure videos. Subscribe if you're new, like if you enjoy, and I'll see you later.